what is your favorite place in your local community?
It's a good question. So I live in Eugene, but one of my favorite places locally is Clearwater Park and riding my bike on the river path through Eugene into Springfield, into Clearwater Park.
Nice. Not very many Eugenians reference a Springfield location. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll take it. Um, I've only been there like one or two times, but I have so many friends
Yeah.
from the area who have gone their whole life, and then I've ridden out there a couple times because the path went in. If the path wouldn't have
Yeah. The
gone in,
path's
I wouldn't have
amazing.
been
Yeah.
out
That
there.
was something we discovered early in the pandemic. And I was like, I love the river path in Eugene, but I think it's so cool to be able to leave from my house and ride on these paths all the way to this really beautiful, somewhat remote park.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite part is the mills. I actually temp worked in
Yeah.
one of the mills for a
Yeah.
while. So
Oh,
I
cool.
was like, oh, that's my yard. I
The mill
worked in
race.
that yard
Yeah.
right there. Anyway, how cool. And I'll put a lot more like some of your bio stuff out so we can kind of skip over some of that. But I'm curious about like your journey and like how you first heard about the Oregon EPIC model program, the Sustainable City program, and what your first impression was.
Yeah, when I was interviewing at U of O 8 years ago, SCYP was fairly new at that time. I think it was in maybe its third or fourth year. And it was, something that came up on the interview, and I was really interested in the idea of pairing communities with projects. I had done a lot of hypothetical projects and classes, and so I was really excited about this chance to partner. But in some ways, SCYP kind of fell in my lap because I was teaching the human settlements class in the fall term, my very first term. And so that class is part of the 3 course sequence with the other first year community and regional planning classes. And so I just was sort of, kind of thrown into it in a sense in that class. And then sort of seeing how the model worked, I then sought opportunities to bring that same type of work into my own classes. So I think it was the third or fourth year I was teaching budgeting. We started to do SCYP, and that made the budgeting class so much better in so many ways by actually working on real projects instead of kind of hypotheticals and textbooks. So yeah, I was really interested in it, intrigued about how it worked, and then sort of wanted more and more in the classes that worked out.
Cool. And this is kind of what we ask members in our network just so they can collaborate and find out connections that they didn't know. All right. So what are some of the priorities you're working on this year?
So my primary research area is in land use and growth management. And more recently, I'm most interested in how land use policy connects to housing, transportation, and climate policy. So how we can better tie our transportation investments with zoning and housing to really sync up our transportation network and our land use system and the regulatory approaches to housing better. And I've done a lot of work on kind of getting climate, transportation, and land use integrated in general, but really putting my effort towards that synthesis of these disparate parts of my own research agenda. Yeah.
Cool. And finally, for the lightning round, describe your first interaction with the school community partnership project.
So really, I think U of O was the first place I was on either end of a school community partnership project. My master's degree was based at the University of Maryland in the DC area, and now they have an EPIC type program called PALS. But when I was there, the projects were mostly aligned with federal agencies, and there wasn't a lot of direct interaction. And then when I was at Florida State, it was kind of similar where the one applied project was the studio class. And I did the hypothetical city project in my land use class. And we did a lot of hypothetical projects, but not a lot of applied direct connections. So coming here, all of my research has always been really applied, but being able to bring that into the classroom has been really valuable. And I think it helps students learn. It helps me teach better. I think it's a win-win-win for everyone in terms of how it works.
Nice, thanks. So yeah, the main, now we can get into the big focus area of what I was hoping to get into, which is so many of the programs that we talk to ask about how does this help faculty and you've highlighted the course benefits for students, but how does this help them generate research? And how did your participation help you with that?
Yeah, so I think there's some great examples of how projects that have emerged from communities that are partnering with the Sustainable City Year program at U of O have aligned with research. There are other instances where the connection, I would say, is less direct, and that's fine. Usually students, it still makes the class better and students are getting a ton out of it, even if it doesn't sort of materialize in a publication for me. I would say mostly, teaching and research are fairly disparate in a lot of ways. And so to be able to work on a project for a community that is teaching related and research related is really rare anyways, outside of that model. But the sort of successful example that's sort of most recent and most tangible is working alongside the Urbanism Next program and kind of thinking about AV impacts on cities. We started to think about what that would mean for budget sources. And it was a sort of great option for a project for the budgeting class. It was something that the clients were really interested in terms of thinking about long-term transportation needs. And so 2 years in a row, we did projects in the budgeting class that looked at projecting the AV impacts, or the impacts of AVs on transportation revenues at a city level in Oregon cities. That also was actually funded by a research grant. In 1 year, the NITSE research grant funded a project with the cities of Eugene and Gresham. And so there was a really great alignment between Sustainable City Year program, Urbanism Next, and NITSE funding to do all of these classes that year. But for me in particular, it was an opportunity to do a second round of a similar project in the CYP model. And that was every other time before it had been, a different project, a parks district for one, an economic improvement district for another. And those were great applied projects, but this was a chance to kind of do the same project 2 years in a row. That meant that there was data collected that then, later on, a couple of years after the class now, I've had a chance to take the sort of raw data, standardize it, clean it up, and then write it up in a way that was turned into a publication. So there's a lot of ways this conversation is really timely because I just kind of finished that process. What was really interesting, though, was I was doing that work on budgeting and it was coming up in some of our research presentations because it was such a new topic that no one had really done much work on it. And that meant that 1 year at the Transportation Research Board conference, I presented, I think, 4 different times the same work. So I took the work from the classes, I standardized it, cleaned it up, created some graphics, created a poster, created a PowerPoint presentation to explain the process, and standardized all the underlying data and those sorts of things. And so I was able to take those seeds of ideas that came out of student projects and then really sort of standardize it so that it was rigorous research in a way that could really inform policy and make sure that everything was on the same page. But that was really, really great. And those topics were highly informative to policymakers and other scholars who are interested in these topics.
Cool. And you mentioned in there something about how not all of the projects of an EPIC model program really align to this because community needs change, and that's such a big part of what the EPIC model projects are. Is what are the ideas of community? What are the priorities of the local community outweigh the faculty's research interest? That's a big part of our model and why we work, right? So I'm curious, how do you, if you're looking at a different program or even the U of O's program, how would you suggest somebody else should look for a research opportunity? Kind of like you did. You might have commented on this a little bit, but I'm curious, could you rephrase it or answer it again at that point?
So I think it has to do with, there's got to be a lot of pieces that align in terms of step one is that you're teaching a class that aligns with your research area, which is not always the case. And that you find, the way projects are generally circulated in our model is there's sometimes a draft or like a speed round of trying to chat with the clients to see what our mutual interests are. I think for me, I've always gone into those meetings with some ideas of things that I think would work well in the class. And that has helped kind of steer the conversations in productive ways. So kind of thinking like, you're in a class and you're having these great conversations with students and they're coming up with great ideas and they have really great, modern, innovative questions around what we're doing. That leads me to think like, oh, that'd be really cool to kind of try to think about that question more broadly and more deeply. And so questions that emerge from one class around, for example, what does Airbnb mean for revenues within a jurisdiction? Those are types of things that like really modern, current topics that are conversation in one class that then I can have a conversation with the client about. And then that can lead to some sort of research project on some sort of newish topic that I haven't had a chance to study. But the class can really, help frame out what that looks like. So I think it's a combination of having some sort of sense of how, what would your ideal be for a topic that you would study in a class that could help generate data or ideas for some sort of, usually I would say like newer, more burgeoning research projects. And then how does that align with what the community might need? And again, it doesn't work for every community and every year, but with the right sort of set of partners, it can be really valuable in terms of moving in that direction. I think for me, my number one is that the projects align with the objectives I have for the course and that the projects will yield what I want the students to get out of the experience. And so that's always at the forefront. But if there's ways to make it really interesting and engaging for students that also aligns with things I'm interested in, that align with my research interests, that's great for everyone because it also makes me feel like I have expertise in that topic and I can advise students better on it. There are definitely times at which we're working on revenue generation for parts of city government that I'm less in tune with, but working on something that's aligned with my research interests, I think also helps make the class go really well.
And then the other thing that you mentioned in the last answer that I wanted to get to eventually, but this is a great way to start it, is you mentioned urbanism next. So I'm curious if you could talk about the journey from your perspective of the creation of that center and how it came about. And then I'll have another question probably about it as we go in.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So SCI Sustainable Cities Institute has always done research. And a Sustainable City Year program was kind of a core area within, or the core area within SCI at the time. But there was effort around trying to sort of coalesce around a single research interest. And in one year that looked like a topic around framing livability, and that was connected with several research grants and faculty across campus, and some graduate students doing kind of research work to create some white papers that related to that. Later on, Urbanism Next kind of emerged as not just a single theme, but a longer term and more in-depth research agenda to think about the impacts of new technology, autonomous vehicles, sharing economy on cities. And so the idea was kind of thinking about the interdisciplinary nature of these topics, working across campus, working across different types of organizations, inside and outside of campus. So thinking at regional, state, local levels, with business sector, with the private sector, with the public sector, around the impacts of this technology. And so there were several, sort of starting out on this, there were several kind of small symposiums and then eventually a bigger conference. And alongside all of that, there was kind of creation of faculty research from different people around campus, synced in with these topics. And so the way SCYP and Urbanism Next ended up working together. So I think originally there wasn't the conception that they would be integrated. But and the role that I was in at the time as research director with Urbanism Next and someone teaching a lot of these classes, I would think, oh, these would be really interesting things for graduate students to think about, because they're going to be entering into the field. And it's really important for them. We don't want to be teaching graduate students 50 years old textbooks that aren't current to current topics.
Right.
Yeah.
let's
bring
about
in
autonomous
these new
vehicles.
topics. Right. Let's bring in these new topics that are going to be relevant and important to their careers. And so around that time, we applied for research funding that would then align with cities that could sort of lead to this collaborative model between SCYP and Urbanism Next, and coalesce in this project. I think that actually the first budgeting project that was AV related, which I think was your class, was out of the TriMet project. And that relationship happened in terms of the budgeting class because we'd already been in conversations through Urbanism Next, through a regional sort of convening that Urbanism Next was doing at the time. So some of those, I think one of the ways that some of this is aligned has been through just collaboration and conversation with contacts across both. It's like, that'd be something I could do in my class. That would be a great project for students to look at in a class. And that kind of stuff has worked out really well in terms of just figuring out how to seed ideas and figuring out how to scope things that work really well within the confines of a class.
And going back a little bit, thank you for describing Urbanism Next and how you saw it come to fruition. But I want to go back to the part where it went from you'd convene around issues like livability framework or livable cities. No, whatever that theme was.
Framing livability.
That theme of that year, whatever that was. Yeah, framing livability. And how you moved from that to urbanism. Like what happened? What did you see? And what was any of it the EPIC, like SCYP at play? Because I feel like it was you and Nico and Mark, two of which are not transportation, like heavily focused professors. Well, Nico is an architect professor, and you're a planning professor, but mostly focused in budgeting. And Mark is the transportation. So I'm just curious about how, like, where did that come out of? Was it different than what you had done with the framing livability? Was it influenced by the SCYP model and the projects you were working on? If so, how?
Yeah, I think it was separate than all of
or
that.
Am I stretching?
I think it had more to do with kind of identifying this need that was out there that I think it was around the time that AVs were starting to come up in Transportation Research Board meetings, of which all three of us have attended over time, because even though Mark's the only sort of transportation focused person, all of us kind of dabble in transportation. And so it was kind of looking at how things were being framed around AVs and noticing that there was this big gap, and planners and designers and sort of more development oriented people weren't in the room, even though the sort of impacts were going to be more broad. So I think at that point it was somewhat separate from both EPIC and SCYP. But over time, there was more sort of recognition of the chance to collaborate between the two. And I think that's a really good, and I think that model could work otherwise. And I think it's these sort of university research level initiatives, of which, now there's one at the University of Oregon around environment initiative. SCI has been doing environmental stuff for a really long time. There's lots of environmental stuff happening, but I think that there's ways that you could take a research initiative at a university level and tie it in with a theme through SCYP, with a particular community or a particular set of communities to align that more directly. I think for us, it happened organically, based on relationships and based on kind of needs and projects. But I think that there's ways it could happen differently as well.
Thank you. That helps a lot. And I think it segues nicely into the next question, which is, if you were to talk to someone who's like an innovation research officer at a university, or they're out of the office of engagement and they keep getting asked by faculty, how is this going to help with my research and tenure and promotion? I think first, if you could take it from like an organizational standpoint, like what would you suggest? And then maybe more after that, maybe more of a personal, like as an individual faculty, this is what, I'm thinking about how this helped me or something like that.
Yeah. So I think from a university level, I think that there's, particularly for public universities, there's a lot of value in doing work that has positive and broad impacts on the communities in which we work, whether that be the city in which we're located or the more broad, state, particularly for a state university. So I think that we have missions that are around serving these places. And I think that oftentimes faculty, there's a lot of pent up demand to partner with communities, but there's not always the framework or the resources to support that demand in ways that are efficient to the faculty or the institution. And so I think that from a university perspective, this makes you look really good. This makes faculty happy because it helps them, figure out how to partner and take some of the burden of doing the work individually with each individual class and each individual project off of that individual faculty in ways that can be way more efficient and way more broad, have broader impacts. And so then I think there's also, again, this like broader impact for the students. They're going to be going out into the real world, doing real projects. And so I think that this is a really important part of the educational system, both for the educational mission of the university, as well as the sort of broader career development for, the people that we're sending out into the world. From a faculty perspective, I think, the couple of the benefits, or several of the benefits, I think I've said this already, but it made my classes so much better. When I went from having these made up scenarios that I had adapted from either my own graduate work or from a textbook, students really had trouble engaging in that, particularly for kind of a difficult topic to understand, budgeting. But when I made that project hands-on and more applied with the community, students really started to appreciate, understand it, grasp it a lot better. And I think it has changed students' appreciation for the topic in a lot of ways that are really impactful for the field. And then I think so there's another class that I've been teaching that's my core research area, growth management. And it took us 5 or 6 years to find a project that would be a good fit there. And actually one of the first ones was a NITSE Urbanism Next, Eugene Gresham land use project. And that was another, so I used to have a term paper, and the term paper is always really tough in a 10-week quarter. For students to really put their arms around the topic and write an individual paper. And making that an applied project really helps students dig more deeply into code and things that are going to be more relevant for the ways in which they're working outside of a research side of things. And so we've done some work on missing middle housing. We've done some work on mixed use zoning and land use planning more broadly. And those things have helped the students understand the topic better. So I think while research is part of it, I think it also just makes your job as faculty teaching so much more gratifying and so much more meaningful and impactful by sort of doing these projects that have real impact. And I think that by working within the model, that there's a centralized system that's helping you match and helping you scope out the projects. That really makes it work smoothly in ways that I think were helpful for me overall. It made me a better teacher. It made me a more successful faculty member. It also, made me feel like I was making a difference through the teaching I was doing. And so I think faculty have these 3 different parts of their jobs: teaching, research, and service. And sometimes they're all connected and sometimes they're all really disparate. But I think that, if the teaching part is working really well, that can help your research part go better because your teaching part is working really well. So I think that there's other sort of less tangible ways that aren't necessarily a publication that are really important to note as well.
Or maybe a publication in another field.
Yeah.
We have some of our faculty are really into the curriculum building and design and instructional materials, but not all of them. This maybe is more of a question that we might not, you can tell me if you want to record it or not, but what did the folks who are in charge of the EPIC Model program do to support you as a faculty that really stood out as supportive and helpful to you over the years in terms of your personal faculty growth and promotion and tenure to some degree?
So by that, do you mean the SCYP program at U of O?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Sorry,
thanks.
yeah. So I mean, the actual staffers that were kind of orchestrating that and helping that. I know there's a couple of things that they do, but I'm not sure how that actually reached you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several, I think both tangible and intangible things. One thing that I think was really meaningful was as a junior faculty member involved in SCYP, being able to meet people from across campus who are also teaching classes in SCYP was really great because you don't always have those connections to people across campus. And as you're going up for tenure and meeting other faculty who might be looking at your tenure file eventually is a useful and valuable thing. So making those connections instead of just being, a junior faculty member in a department that doesn't really talk to anyone else across campus, it helps you make some of those connections across campus that aren't always as tangible. I think, yeah, I mean, there's ways in which the senior faculty that participate in the program can nurture and help as well. And I think the other side of this is there needs to be beyond the staff, there needs to be buy-in from the university that this is valuable work and that this is meaningful from a sort of either service or teaching or research perspective. And so the way in which we evaluate faculty needs to acknowledge that, there's more than just peer-reviewed publications. And there needs to be sort of support for, oh, wow, you're teaching in this system. That's great. You're having an impact on the state. And so I think it's there's ways in which various university administrators have or have not seen that. But I think that the SCYP staff can help with some of that in terms of just raising the awareness campus-wide about who we are and what we do and why it matters. So I think that, a lot of it is sometimes the networking and the events that happen can be really, even though it's one time and it's a ton of work that goes into these events, I kind of remember those as being really striking early on in my career of ways to meet people either through happy hours or through the kickoffs or the closeouts or anything like that. So some of that stuff I think is intangible, but really valuable. And I think sort of directly in terms of tenure and promotion, it's that process is so defined by the university. And so the question is whether people within your department, your college, and then the university broadly buy into this and think that it's meaningful and sort of support you as that being something that you've been spending time and effort on. I think, and like I said, I think that even aside from that, there's ways that I think your teaching evaluations improve because you are teaching in this system, and if done well and done right, it makes the class better. That's not always the case. There are times that things are disconnected, but for the most part, I think it makes the class better. And I think that just helps everything overall. So that's a less direct path, but I think is important to note. I never have thought, oh, this is a lot of work. I don't want to do it again. I've always thought, oh, that was great. I have this new idea.
Well, that's good. That's good for sure. And I hadn't thought about the first one in particular, or just how meaningful those events are for faculty. So thank you for sharing those. And I know the Oregon program gives out templates to all the other EPIC programs of a good newsletter, like a thank you letter that goes and gets sent to different folks. But I'm mostly mentioning that so people know that that's a thing. Not really needing a comment on it. And so, I also wanted to ask just one other question, I think, which is maybe not on my list, but how, let me see if I actually noted it or not somewhere else. Oh, yeah. So as you got involved, you were kind of just thrown in, I guess, in the Human Settlements course that's traditionally at the University of Oregon, part of the SCYP year partnership. But if you were to, be approached by a faculty who's considering for the first time at another institution getting involved, what would some of your suggestions be as they're considering and maybe approaching their first class?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that when you're starting to develop the syllabus, really think about how a group project that's applied in the community can help synthesize across multiple course objectives, and give some thought to topics that might work out, and then enter into conversations with, I mean, I think this matching process of projects works a couple different ways. Sometimes there's a list of projects that the community creates as part of the RFP process, and then the EPIC staff matches that with faculty. But there's other times it's more conversational. And I would say, look at your syllabus. This doesn't work for every class. It doesn't work for every topic. But if there is a kind of like final project or group project component that is synthesizing across different course objectives, trying to think about what the real world application of that is, and then trying to think about, what are different models? Because I think it isn't the same topic every year. It isn't the same community every year, but there's lots of different things that can work. And so I think that spending time on the front end, writing out the assignment descriptions alongside working with the client on the scope of work really sets the stage for moving forward. The first time teaching the class, having regular, I always have the staff from the community come visit the class, talk to the students. Sometimes we do field trips. It kind of depends on the year and on the class. But getting the students to make sure they understand the context is really important. Having clients that have buy-in to the project is important. And having regular check-ins, both with the staff, city staff, and with the students is really important. Like these types of projects, as opposed to term papers, do require check-in and sort of progress throughout the term. That's something I've definitely learned over time, that sort of requiring some interim deadlines throughout really makes them more successful at the very end. But I think that overall, it works really, really well in that system, and that there might be hiccups the first year or so, but overall, I think it makes the class better overall. And I wouldn't be afraid of it, and I wouldn't be afraid of it being a time suck. I think that there's a lot of ways that it can help you be more efficient in your time, and be more efficient in the way that you're delivering content and that students are absorbing that content. So yeah, like I said, it doesn't work for every single class and every single topic, but if you do have a group project or you do have a term paper already built in, it's definitely a great thing to consider.
We might have to do another interview with you about how you make it more efficient than a course without a partner. Because that sounds like a genius thing. If you've been able to put that together.
One thing to say there is that when, if you, for example, I went from having individual term papers to having group projects, there's a lot of efficiency gained, and sort of working with 4 teams instead of working with 20 students on individual projects. And I think the students learn better that way, honestly. I think that working on group projects where they learn from each other really nurtures that experience. So that part is way more efficient. Grading, for example, is one example.
Awesome. Yeah, and there's the redundancy of the students working together for the quality control piece for your client.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
that's something I really appreciated about your class, as being a participant, as I saw some models there that valued the community partner because it created a redundancy in case something went wrong. And that's a good idea, and it's something that a lot of the EPIC programs do, but it's not always recognized and not always done. So
thank you to Rebecca Lewis for joining EPIC-N on this interview. To learn more about EPIC-N and our work, sign up for the EPIC-N member commons at commons.epicn.org.